The House on the Hill is the reading story of the day. A poor boy and a rich girl. It was a beautiful summer evening. Peter was happy. No more exams. College was finished. Now he needed a job. He wanted to be a writer and work for a newspaper. But first, he needed a rest. It was hot in the house. There was no wind. "I'll go for a walk," said Peter to himself. "I'll go down to the river." Peter lived in a small town and he was soon outside in the country. He walked near the river and watched the water boats. Suddenly, he saw the girl. She was standing alone, looking into the water. She was young and very beautiful. She has long dark hair and she was wearing a pretty white dress. Peter went up to her. "Hello," he said. "What's your name?" "I'm Mary," she said, and she smiled at him. Peter and Mary talked for a long time. The sun went down. It was nearly dark. "I must go home," said Mary. "Where do you live?" asked Peter. "In the big white house on the hill," said Mary. "Where do you live?" "In the little brown house near the market," said Peter. They laughed, but Peter was sad. The house on the hill was big and important. Mary was rich and he was poor, and Peter was in love. After that, Peter and Mary often met near the river. Mary always wore beautiful clothes. She always looked lovely. Peter thought about Mary all day and every day. One evening, Peter said, "Listen, Mary, I have written a poem about you." He took a piece of paper from his pocket and read the poem. "I met her in the evening by the riverside. Her dress was creamy white, and her hair with ribbon tied. She turned and smiled at me, and I asked her for her name, told I am young and poor. My love will stay the same." "You are wonderful, Peter," said Mary. "I love your poem." Peter took Mary's hand. He looked into her eyes. "I love you, Mary," he said. "Do you love me?" She smiled. "Yes, of course. I love you," she said. She stood up. "I must go home now." Peter was very happy. She loves me. Mary loves me, he thought. Peter went home. The little brown house was small and poor, but it was always clean and tidy. Peter lived alone with his mother. His father was dead. That evening, his mother watched him. "What happened, Peter?" she asked. "Why are you so happy?" "It's nothing, Mother," said Peter. His mother smiled. "He's in love," she thought. The next day, Peter and Mary met again by the river. Mary looked sad, but Peter did not notice. He took her hand. "Mary," he said, "I am poor now, but one day I am going to be a famous writer." Mary said nothing. "Will you marry me, Mary? Say yes. We will be happy and..." He stopped. Mary looked at him for a moment. There were tears in her eyes. Slowly, she shook her head. Then she turned and ran away. "Mary!" shouted Peter, but Mary has gone. Peter went home slowly. He did not understand Mary. "What's wrong?" he thought. "She loves me, doesn't she?" His mother was waiting for him. She saw his face. "Oh, poor boy," she thought. "The girl doesn't love him." Peter and his mother ate their supper in silence. Suddenly, somebody knocked on the door. Peter opened it. A man in a servant's uniform stood outside. "I'm from the house on the hill," he said. "My mistress wants to see Peter." "That's me," said Peter. "Can you come with me now?" said the servant. "Yes," said Peter. He was excited. Perhaps Mary has changed her mind, he thought. Perhaps she does want to marry me. Peter's mother stood at the door of the house. She watched Peter and the servant. "The house on the hill," she said to herself. "I know those people, a rich old woman and her beautiful daughter, my poor son." It was not far to the house on the hill. The servant took Peter up the wide steps and into the house. Peter was excited, and his heart was beating fast. Everything was rich and grand. There were beautiful carpets, pictures, and mirrors. Peter saw himself in a mirror. He looked terrible. This place was so rich, and he looked so poor. The servant opened a door. Peter went inside. An old lady was sitting in a big chair. Mary stood behind her. The old woman was ugly. Her eyes were small and cold, and her mouth was thin and hard. Her own hands were covered with big rings. She looked proud and angry. Peter looked at the old woman, then at Mary. "What an ugly woman," he thought. "Is she Mary's mother?" "So, you want to marry my daughter?" the old woman said. Her voice was hard. Peter looked at her bravely. "Yes," he said. "I love Mary, and I want to marry her." The old woman laughed. "You a poor student, no money, no father, nothing. My daughter will never marry you." Peter said nothing. He looked at Mary. She did not look at him. "I am poor now," he said, "but one day I'll be a famous writer." The old woman laughed again. "No," she said, "my daughter is not for you. She is going to be married soon. You will never see her again." The old woman got up and she left the room. Mary and Peter were alone. Peter looked at Mary, but she did not look at him. She stood still and did not say anything. Peter went up to her and put his arms around her. Mary moved away from him. "I'm sorry, Peter," said Mary. "My mother is right. I can't marry you. I don't want to be poor. I want money and clothes and a big car. But you love me, Mary, said Peter. And I love you. He did not understand her. He was angry. Yes, I love you, Peter, said Mary. But love isn't enough. She looked at him. Her face was sad. I'm getting married in 2 weeks, she said. Goodbye, Peter. I'm sorry. Peter left the house and ran down the hill to the river. He sat there for a long time. Mary loves me. I know she loves me, he thought. But she is marrying another man. She's marrying him for money. It's her matter. Mary is afraid of that old ugly woman. Oh, Mary, Mary, what should I do? After a long time, Peter went home. There was a light in the window of the little house. The door was open. His mother was waiting for him. She looked at his face. Then she put her arms around him. They are bad people, my son, she said. You must forget her.